you have these habits that specifically aren't sustainable during the digging phase of a contest prep where, you know, let's be honest, I don't care how flexible you think you're being when your macros are like 120 grams of carbs, 40 grams of fat, and 200 grams of protein. It's going to look a certain way, and it's going to be a lot of broccoli, a lot of chicken breast, and not a whole lot else, you know, and insert a couple fruit, swap out the broccoli for something else. Oh, I'm getting crazy today. I'm eating canned tuna. Very exciting. So that's great. But then when you start to shift towards eating more, whether that is a refeed day during contest prep, or whether that is you're starting to, you know, eat up into your show, or even your exit strategy postseason, you probably don't want to maintain that behavior, but you don't want to completely abandon it either, you know? So it is this kind of dial that you have to learn how to turn to where the, you know, certain level of macros can look different, and that may be less or more facilitative towards your goals. So I think when someone is diced to their socks and they are trying to actually eat up into a show, you don't totally change your diet as you start adding in some more of these amounts of carbs and fats, because you don't want to start getting hungrier, which can actually happen as you add food, you know. But at the same time, you want to eat up into your show, you know, not burning fiber. You want to actually get some more glycogen stored, and you need to make some changes. So I think there's a fine balance to at what point do you start to swap out food sources or just have more of the same. And I think there's probably some relationships between the people who lose weight on a refeed or gain weight on refeed has something to do with that. I do think people who maintain a whole lot of fruit, vegetables, and then just add a little bit of carbs on top of that for their refeeds, those typically are people who gain weight on a refeed. But the people who switch to a whole bunch of energy-dense foods, they will typically lose weight, and that's literally just because they're eating less weight of foods. And I find those are also the people who report, you know what, I actually get hungry on my refeed days. Because we've got actually a fair amount of data to suggest that a large aspect, not all of the aspects that influence this, but a large aspect of how much food do you eat habitually if left to your own devices comes to the weight of the food. You know, if you eat 2 pounds of food, you're probably going to keep eating 2 pounds of food. And then if you change the composition of it, that can result in a calorie deficit or surplus based on the energy density. Again, not the only thing, but it is a thing that influences satiety mechanically, and also has a direct influence on weight. One of the strategies, my first tier of making weight, and this is a total tangent, but just to kind of illustrate it, for making weight for a powerlifting meet is for 2 to 3 days before the meet, simply replacing fruits, vegetables, and complex carbs with dark chocolate. That's how I go from 95 to 93. That's how Barb recently just made weight for her bench only comp. She dropped, you know, about 800 grams. And it's literally, if you think about it, an apple, a salad, and a chicken breast, that's like a 1 pound meal, you know. But you can have 70 grams of dark chocolate that gets you a similar amount of calories, and then a protein shake, and you just lost, you know, like 300 grams of weight. Boom, right there. So I think you do that for a couple meals, and you can very quickly find how this can modify the scale weight and what we see on refeed days. So anyway, bit of a tangent, bit of all over the place. But Berto, anything more you want to say on the topic of what food sources you like to manipulate at different time points in prep or transitions, or things that you do want in place from the off season going into prep maybe?
I think a big one, I think especially now with all the tools that we have available when dieting, and I'm talking about those weird foods that are, I don't know, like pita breads that are low calorie, things like that, right? As helpful as they can be on paper, I think there's just a certain point where it's like, hey, like let's not lean on labels too much. Actually, an old friend of mine posted, it was called a Bolani bread.
I remember this.
They're popular in the Bay. He posted it the other day. He's like, if you know, you know. And I remember we were having trouble having him lose weight, and he pops up his fridge very proudly, and he's like, "Look at these things. They're like 70 calories," and it's like, there's no way. There's no way. So yeah, I'd say some of those foods that on literally on paper on the nutritional label might seem friendly. It's like there's just a certain point where, especially when you're really trying to pull in those last few pounds, it's like let's maybe not lean on those too much. I know that for me, once I get close enough, it's like those things gotta go.
So you're talking about foods where there is potential ambiguity as
Yes.
to the accuracy of the label claims, right? So
Yeah.
where it's like a small company making a unique food, putting it together and kind of slapping a label on there versus something like a large apple.
Yeah, and we've all been there. We've all eaten those foods where you're like, this is too good to be true, but this is just like too good to put down, right?
Hmm.
Especially when you're lean and hungry. So that that's probably something that, yeah, I would probably just go over with my athlete at a certain point, especially if we're having a little bit of trouble,
Hmm.
and especially they seem to be suffering a little bit because usually the ones that are really starting to feel it, they tend to resort to those things a lot more. Um, So yeah, that's one. And then the other way around, sometimes you get so caught up in those habits of being that meticulous and that precise in regards to like what's in your food that um, I know coming out of my first few preps that bothered me a lot, where I didn't know the exact like macronutrient and caloric breakdown of certain foods. Like
Hmm.
that took some retraining the first few times.
Yep.
But
Berto, I just
yeah.
want to note there's something. I think people go two different directions when they get hungry and prep. Some people are actively aware that they just want to eat more, and they start looking at foods and they go, okay, how do I get larger portion sizes without
Hmm.
going over my macros? And then other people, they look for things to basically fit their cravings, right? They try to look for the low calorie ice cream options, or they're the ones eating Arctic Zero back when we all knew it was terrible. But you know, when you can taste the sugar in tomato sauce, that's when things are going to go bad. So I think people who go those two different directions, there's a different coaching strategy for both of them, in my opinion. Because the people who are just like, yeah, so I ate a pound of broccoli today. I'm like, oh my God, I feel bad for your roommates, one, and that's why you gained a pound.
Yeah.
And you're not going to shit for a day, but okay. So I think, so how do you approach it? And what signs do you have to figure out where a client is on that spectrum, either going towards, trying to fit in things for cravings or just trying to eat more volume?
Yeah, it's like a volume versus intensity debate, right? It's like the volume is the
Yeah.
solid guy, and the guy that just wants that intense blast of flavor or perceived flavor, because Arctic Zero was terrible in hindsight. Um,
Mm.
yeah, what ends up happening is if you like just like lifting, right? You go too far in one direction, it's going to break you, right? So yeah, again, it's uh it's always finding that middle ground, and to me, I determine where they're at based off like what they were doing. Yeah, in the off season when hopefully they weren't hungry. If they were like terribly hungry, then that's a whole different animal and different things to talk about. But yeah, usually what you were doing in your off season, because that's when the best time to learn good habits is when you have enough fat on you as a bodybuilder. Um, that's kind of sort of the person I'm going to have to deal with. So the old school guys, they've done the menus, they've done the meal prep. With them, it's like, hey, let me pull you a little bit more in this direction, and for a number of different reasons. Some of them you just described, we're going to have a better contest prep, because hey, we're not having green beans pre-workout anymore, right? Um, and then the other way around, someone who is just kind of extra pliable, maybe overly neurotic when it comes to the tracking. It's like, oh man, this is going to turn like really freaking weird towards the end of your contest prep. Um, and yeah, with those people, you do have to ask them like on a weekly basis, like, hey, can I just see what you're eating for a minute? Because yeah, you want a nice little balance of both things. And once and you've said this before, once you've done this long enough and you've mastered both sides of the coin, there's less and less contrast between your off season and your on season. They're so different. but
Mm-hmm.
there's less and less contrast. And I can say that for you. I can say that for me. Like when we compare our old super bloaty off seasons and like what we were eating then, and then like the tail end of our first few contest preps, they they're very different. And now, like fast forward, man, I'd say the first half of the prep, most people would not be able to really see the difference from afar, to be quite honest.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, Steve, I want to bring you into this because I think the kind of the old school, especially non-dietitian perspective on this would have been, say, 2005 to maybe 2012 or even 13, is it's not my job to talk to you about your food choices. Here are your macros. And now, God, that seems like wholly irresponsible to not that you have to give someone a meal plan necessarily, but to not have a discussion about like, hey, like what does your meal composition look like? What's your structure? What foods are you selecting? How are you dealing with your hunger cravings? Are you having hunger cravings? That kind of thing. The old school perspective was just like, none of that matters. Just hit your targets. And so, yeah, I would love to know how much involvement do you have on that? What key things are you looking for? And like I was asking, Berto, how do you deal with clients who are, and you already touched on this to some degree, so don't feel the need to repeat yourself. How do you deal with the clients who are chasing cravings versus those who are chasing volume? And yeah, how do you discover that as well?
Basically everything gets filtered through like questions. So almost every week I'll just ask, how is your appetite this week? And so if the appetite's good, I don't address anything. But then eventually, somewhere along the way, in the fat loss phase, like, yeah, I've noticed like I'm getting pretty hungry. And then from there, like we'll pull up their MyFitnessPal account, and like you said, we'll just kind of go through and look at food choices. And the other thing I always have people do is like track fruits and veggies. So it's like I can always see where their fruits and veggies and protein are at. So it's like first thing is like what I love about even the fat loss phase, even though it's not as aggressive as like a contest prep, like for somebody who's like never been like crazy shredded, like it feels like they're getting crazy shredded. And so it's like they may have been struggling to like hit their protein, fruits, and veggies, but they start getting hungrier. If I notice those things are low, I'm like, well, that's why we have the minimums in there. And so those are the first things I look at. If all that stuff is sufficient, then I'll kind of move to the MyFitnessPal, like I said, and look at like food choices, food selections. I don't know. I mean, and I'll look at like meal spacing. So typically just the line that I found is like no more than 5 hours without eating. Like we all know there's nothing magical about, if you wait longer or eat less than 5 hours, but it's just like, I find that like past that line, people just start getting super hungry most of the time. And that's when typically overeating occurs. So I'll kind of go through their day and just, hey, when do you eat first? When do you eat second? When do you eat third? When do you eat fourth? Whatever. And if I start noticing it's more than 5 hours, we'll throw a snack in there. Something like that.
No, I like that.